My dad's more important than your dad. 3 young boys were bragging about the importance of their dads. The first boy begins the bragging. He says, my dad is really important. He's a songwriter. He scribbles a few words on a piece of paper, calls it a song, and they pay him $500. The second kid, not to be outdone, brags, that ain't nothing. My dad's a lawyer. He scribbles a few words on a paper, calls it a brief, and they pay him $1,000. And the third young boy speaks up. Ha, you think your dads are important? My dad's a preacher. He scribbles a few words on a piece of paper, calls it a sermon, and it takes 4 people to haul in all the cash. I wonder if that's really the case. I share that with you because today I've been given the responsibility and the privilege to talk to you about church and everybody's favorite, money. In particular, this morning, I would like to share with you part 1 of a 2-part message titled Signs of a Faithful Congregation. There are certain actions and activities a church does that are good indicators not only that a church is faithful, but also effective in carrying out God's call on it. Many of these things you probably know for yourself. You know what makes a good church an effective church. But to make it a little easier today, I'd like to first share the 5 practices of fruitful congregations identified by Bishop Robert Schnase, which are akin to the signs, very much like the signs of a faithful congregation. And he lists them this way. First is radical hospitality, then passionate worship, intentional faith development, risk-taking missions and service, and the last, extravagant generosity. When a church has these things going on in its life and ministry, the church can be said to be highly effective. Now, I know there's more to it than that, of course, but those are the basics. Schnase offers an entire study of the 5 practices, and maybe at some point it would be good for us to go through that as a church, but for today and next week, I'd like to focus on only one. I bet you can guess which one I want to focus on. Extravagant generosity. Here's what Schnase says about it. Generosity describes the Christian's unselfish willingness to give in order to make a positive difference for the purposes of Christ. Congregations that practice extravagant generosity provide ministries that address our spiritual need to give in ways that exceed all expectations and extend to unexpected measures. Fruitful congregations thrive because of extraordinary sharing, willing sacrifice, and joyous giving out of love for God and neighbor. Now, there is a reason why I would like to focus on extravagant generosity for the next 2 weeks, is because we are taking this short amount of time, both this Sunday and next Sunday, to consider how we will support the ministry of our church in 2023 through our giving. So yes, it's time to talk about stewardship once again, particularly the stewardship of our finances and what that means as we think about how we will personally support the church that we love. We won't take a lot of time to do it, as I've just said, just today and next week. In fact, we are asking all of you to return your estimate of giving card I'm hoping you received in the mail this past week by bringing it with you to worship next Sunday. So we have this Sunday and next Sunday to consider what we will give in 2023. But after we have our breakfast together next week at 9:30, we'll have the opportunity to present and consecrate our estimates during the worship service. And it's my hope we will anticipate being extravagant givers, just one indication that Lehman Church will continue to strive to be a faithful and fruitful congregation. The scripture you heard this morning is a great example of the promise of God, or the people of God, responding to a financial need that was present, and in doing so, showing themselves as a faithful people. We read about King Joash. He was a good king who served for 40 years, and he ruled over God's people in the late 9th century BC. He was mentored by a faithful high priest named Jehoiada, who no doubt had a great deal of influence over this young king. Eventually, Joash led the effort to repair the crumbling temple of God in Jerusalem, and the temple was badly in need of repair because it had been robbed of its worship items for the service of Baal, who was a very well-known false god. And the temple itself was neglected during the reign of Athaliah. But with the help of the high priest, Joash undertook the repair of the temple, and Jehoiada and the priests were using their free will offerings to finance the work up to that time, but apparently it did not move fast enough for young King Joash. So it was the king who devised a plan of his own to raise the money to restore the temple. He had constructed the first money collection box in the form of a chest with a hole in the top of it. This box was placed at the gate of the temple for all the offerings. Each day, its contents were counted by the king's officers and handed over to the builders. And the work on the temple was soon completed, and there was enough money left over to provide new worship items to replace the ones that had been stolen in service of the sanctuary. Now, I think there are a couple of important things to notice in this story, and particularly 3 reasons to sacrificially give, for that is what the story is truly about. While it was Joash who initiated the raising of the funds necessary to fix the temple, it was the people who came through. If there aren't any people who give, it doesn't matter what you would like to do. It didn't matter that Joash wanted to fix the temple unless the people came through with their giving. Verse 10 says this: "This pleased all the leaders and the people, and they gladly brought their money and filled the chest with it." I would emphasize the word gladly in that sentence, brought their money. Apparently, the people of Jerusalem and Judah had a very positive attitude toward being asked to give, and it was probably the number one reason why the temple was able to be restored. Yes, it was the king's idea, but it was also God's command for the people to bring the proper temple tax, and that was prior to King Joash's command or his order to bring money to the temple. But regardless whether it was God's command prior to King Joash's command, without the conviction and the cooperation of the people, the work would not have been done. The people gave faithfully. And the point that not only was the temple reconstructed to its original specifications, but there was also enough money left over to replace the stolen worship items. When God's people have a heart for the things of God, in this case, restoring the temple, taking care of the church, sacrificial giving is a natural and easy thing to do. It is a mark of faithful people. Another thing to notice in this story is the king's relationship with God. Although not explicitly stated, it does say that Joash did right in the sight of God. No doubt this had something to do with the kind of mentoring he got from the high priest, but Joash's heart was inclined toward God. So there's something to be said for being in a right relationship with God that makes giving easier. It's the first reason we should sacrificially give to the ministry, because we have a relationship with God. Not only is there a right relationship that seems to be present in the king and in the people, but there is also the responsibility that has to be taken seriously. If the king and the people of that moment were not to rebuild the temple, then who would? The second reason we should sacrificially give to the building of the church's ministry is because of our personal responsibility to those around us and those who will follow us. We are not responsible for what someone did or did not do in the past, nor can we be responsible for what others will do in the future, but we are responsible for this moment in front of us now. What we do now through our giving will be seen either as an encouragement or a discouragement to those who will follow after us. The third reason we should sacrificially give is because we have the resources to do so. Whenever we make a plan for our own resources other than God's plan, we have to be careful because the question of the lordship of Christ in our lives has not been settled. This indicates an understanding of stewardship. Godly stewardship says that all we have and all we are is God's. God simply gives each of us a portion of his gifts to invest for the benefit of the kingdom. You could make a pretty good guess as to why the Levites or the priests of the temple did not act immediately when the king ordered that the temple be rebuilt. It seemed as though they were only getting enough money to take care of themselves and not the temple. But perhaps the most recognizable reason is that their resources were compromised. Under the Levites' watch, the sons of Athaliah broke into the temple, stole sacred objects, and used them to worship other gods. So you put that together with the temple being in disrepair and the money not coming in, and we understand that the Levites were to blame. It was their fault. They were supposed to take care of things, and they did not do so. They allowed it to happen. So when the king called for action and resources from the Levites, they were incapable of responding in faith, at least certainly not quickly. On the other hand, and thankfully, the people faithfully respond with their resources to King Joash's command, and the temple is rebuilt. We have a long list of gifts God has given to us, to include financial gifts, and we need to remember that we are just stewards of them, and we need to be ready to release them when called upon to do so. Just a reminder to you that it's not about how much we give, but rather why we give. I'd like to read the story of the widow's mite, or the widow's offering, once again to you. You've heard this story before. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on." Surely this widow gave out of her relationship with God and out of a sense of responsibility. But the point of the story is that she gave even though her resources were meager, to the point that Jesus says she gave all she had to live on. In other words, she went all out for the sake of her faith. That's sacrificial giving. That's extravagant giving. She was commended for her faith by Jesus. We are blessed also when we give in the same way. Extravagant giving is a sign of a faithful congregation if we do it together. So the church is asking you, and I as the spokesperson for the church is asking you to consider this week how and what you might offer as an estimate of your giving for 2023. If you didn't get the mailing this past week and you'd like to fill out an estimate of giving card and present that card next Sunday in worship, please call the office and let them know. We'll also have cards available for you next week as well. So you have just this 1 week to consider what your giving might be. But this is one opportunity among others, albeit an important opportunity, for us to show Lehman Memorial Church as an ongoing, faithful group of people committed to responding to God's call. May our sacrificial giving simply be pleasing to God and help to move our church forward in mission and ministry. I hope you'll join me in this task this next week. Amen.